Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of the Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series. People are still joining us, so we will start in just a minute or so. My name is Jeff Horan. I am a forest ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Refuge Program, and that's in the North Atlantic Appalachian region, and with our Forest Ecology Working Group, which worked with partners to create this 12-part webinar series. I'll be moderating today's webinar and monitoring the chat for your questions. And in a few minutes, I'll be introducing Matt Betts. But before I introduce Matt, I want to turn it over to our National Conservation Training Center host, Shannon Connors, to go over some of the webinar logistics. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks, Jeff. So welcome everybody to the second webinar in this series. The Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center, Forest Ecology Working Group, and a Migratory Bird Program. We will share this contact information in the chat box if you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group, or if you'd like to receive continuing education credits for attending these webinars. And just a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. And Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce Matt.
Thank you, Shannon, and also thank you to Jim Siegel, NCTC, and our Forest Bird team for your great assistance. I'll also tell folks that we have over 1,300 people registered for this, and I'll also let folks know that our WebEx platform is contracted to hold 1,000, so it's possible, although I don't think likely, that some folks may not be able to join. But we are recording these sessions, so we will, people will be able to see it, and I suspect we won't have quite that many try to join today. But again, thanks for the interest. So, as I was starting to mention, this is a 12-part Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series. It's jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Forest Ecology Working Group, the National Conservation Training Center, and the Migratory Birds Program. The purpose of the Forest Ecology Working Group and this webinar series is to increase the understanding and integration of forest ecology, applied science, and habitat management principles within the Fish and Wildlife Service and with our partners. The Migratory Birds Program is pleased to be co-sponsoring this webinar series as part of the Partners in Flight program's 30-year celebration, and also the recognition of the documented loss of some 3 billion birds over the last 50 years. So there is still much conservation work for us all to do. Our mantra moving forward will be delineating together the roadmap to recovery for forest birds. If you have questions about this webinar series or our Forest Ecology Working Group, my contact information is on the advertising flyer. And if folks need Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters continuing education credits, they'll be able to contact Jim Siegel. His contact information is also on that flyer. And now, just a few more things before I introduce Matt Betts. As Shannon mentioned, we'll be trying to engage you participants by taking a few questions during the course of today's presentation. We plan to stop after 15 minutes, after 30 minutes, and at the end of Matt's presentation for me to select a question or two from the chat for Matt to answer. After the webinar, we will go back to our work or home offices, and Matt and our Forest Bird team will try to answer all of the questions within a few weeks and send them back to you via email. In fact, by tomorrow, we hope to be sending out answers to the questions received from Ken Rosenberg's webinar number 1. And finally, to run a quick commercial for our third webinar in our 12-part series. Webinar 3 will be May 18th, and it's at our regular time, 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. The topic is climate change, adaptation, and impacts on forest bird recovery. And the speakers will be Maria Genoviak with the U.S. Forest Service's NIAX program and Steve Matthews with the Ohio State University. Now, finally, to introduce Matt Betts. Matt is a professor of landscape ecology and diversity in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. His research focus is primarily on how species respond to landscape change, including forest management. He is the director of the Forest Biodiversity Research Network, the lead investigator for the Oregon Intensive Forest Management Project, co-principal investigator for the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest Long-Term Ecological Research Project, and the Oregon Marbled Murrelet Project. He is the author of over 100 peer-reviewed publications, and his work has been profiled in the New York Times, the Washington Post, on BBC, CBC, Oregon Public Broadcasting's Oregon Field Guide, National Geographic, and also Scientific American. His work is primarily funded by the National Institute for Food and Agriculture and the National Science Foundation. So thanks a lot. A big thank you to Matt Betts. And now let's hear about managing and conserving forests for avian biodiversity. Thank you, Matt. Take it away.
Well, first of all, thanks very much to Jeff for inviting me to give this talk. As Jeff indicated, my job today is to give you really an overview, following on from Ken Rosenberg's excellent talk yesterday, or sorry, a few weeks ago, on decline of the North American avifauna. So my job today is really to talk about what the drivers of some of those declines could be. We'll call this the doom and gloom section of the talk. Then I'm going to try and get a little bit more positive, and we'll talk about ways that forest managers can potentially change habitats in order to increase bird habitat quality. And then finally, we're going to talk about planning whole forest landscapes for bird conservation. And keep in mind, again, this is meant to be an overview. We just don't have time to get into the details, but I'm happy to answer questions after the talk or by email. And I'm sure if all of you are like me, you might be a little bit Zoom weary after 12 months of lecturing and watching lectures on Zoom. So I'm going to try and keep this interesting with a little challenge. Throughout the talk, I'm going to be talking about birds quite a bit, as you probably guessed. And the species diversity in this presentation is reasonably high. So what I want you to do as we go through is to keep a list, those of you who are birders. And you get a point for every bird that you ID by sight or that I mention. And whoever the winner is, Jeff is going to give them a huge, actually no, Jeff's not going to give them anything, and neither am I, but you'll get the pride of being the top birder during the talk. So doom and gloom. As all of you know, and hopefully heard over the last couple decades, the climate is changing. And in this classic paper by Camille Parmesan, she showed empirical data that species worldwide are shifting their ranges northwards and upslope. It's resulting in demographic declines for a number of species as well. And trophic interactions are shifting. Some of the early bird research showing climate effects actually came out of Christian Bost's lab. And in this work with pied flycatcher, they tested the hypothesis that mismatches between the emergence of insect prey, caterpillars, on oaks, and the arrival of pied flycatcher, which are migrants, could be causing negative effects on populations. And so I'm going to claim the figure I'm showing here is just my own simulated data to try and get this idea across. But here you can see a nice match between, in blue, insects and in red, birds. And in this case, birds are timing their reproduction to match the resource abundance. But in some years, especially warmer years, insects might be coming out earlier. Birds are using totally different cues on the wintering grounds and arriving at around the same time as they have historically. And this results in a mismatch where food abundance is lower during peak breeding period than the birds are expecting. And what Christian showed was that in those years, reproduction was lower. And this has been replicated a number of times in different systems around the world. So another mechanism for negative climate effects on bird populations are the direct effects of climate change. And this is a paper that came out very recently in Science by Riddell and others, using 100 years of data, starting with Grinnell's historical surveys of deserts in California. And they showed that not only is the occupancy of sites changing quite dramatically over the last 100 years for birds, but also the richness has dropped by about 43%. And they attributed this, they did some really neat physiological modeling and showed that this effect can be attributed primarily to the cooling costs associated with the climate as it's warmed over the last 100 years. And third, as I mentioned, it's been projected that and shown that species are shifting their ranges northwards. This is some work out of the Audubon that use climate envelope modeling to predict how ranges will shift in the future for a huge number of bird species, over 400 bird species. This is a New York Times article just describing the paper in lay terms. So the blue here is the current range or distribution of the species that they examined, 3 of the species. And the purple is the predicted range distribution under climate change. And as you can see, there's in some cases, these ranges are quite disjunct. And this is one way that birds could adapt to changing climate by moving northwards. But unfortunately, if their habitats, the vegetation is not moving at the same rate, and you'd expect trees to move a bit slower than birds, this could result in quite severe consequences for species. So Audubon estimated that about 2/3 of birds are expected to be at increased risk of extinction due to temperature rise and these range shifting dynamics. Of course, if species manage to be behaviorally plastic and can handle shifting climate, or if they can figure out a way of buffering themselves against climate effects, these predictions might not be as dire. But certainly these are really important predictions to keep in mind. So the second major driver of avian decline, and this, in my view, is one of the top drivers historically until now with climate. And Ken talked about these 3 billion bird decline. And you can see at the very top of his list for declines, or bottom in this graph to the right, are grassland birds. And hopefully all of you have already connected the dots and drawn the lines between what's happening in grasslands and what could be driving those substantial declines since 1970. But I don't think there's any mystery when it comes to the fact that these grassland birds are competing with humans for resources and for area. And so the more native prairie habitat and native grassland we turn into, and especially industrialized agriculture, we can expect grassland birds to be declining. And I mean, in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley where I'm from, we're down to about 1% of native prairie from what it would have been historically 100, 150 years ago. So in thinking about habitat loss, also it shouldn't be news to you that we need to think about the whole annual cycle. And for this redstart, for example, it's not just breeding grounds that influence its demography and population trends, it's habitat change on the wintering grounds as well. And so this proves particularly tricky to get at, as a landscape ecologist, quantifying habitat changes, breeding and wintering grounds, and then also on staging areas, stopover sites during migration. So just a little video that we put together using Matt Hansen's data from a science paper a number of years ago. And what you're going to see on the right here is, well, obviously a map of South America, and the pink are spots that have had greater than 75% canopy cover removed over the period from 2000 to 2014. And again, this probably won't be surprising to you, but the rate of forest loss, even during this period actually of time that was relatively slow for forest loss compared to the current period under Bolsonaro, quite a dramatic effect. And for a number of my favorite migrant warblers, the pink spots there are places they overwinter. Black burning warbler, which was the opening slide you saw a photo of, is wintering in Colombia. And you can see that quite a lot of pink in the especially Sierra area of Colombia. So a third major driver of declines has to do less with forest loss than it does forest change and degradation. So if you look at Matt Hansen's maps, that's what you've got on the left, and this is an area of Western Oregon near Corvallis. You can see the pink, which is forest loss, like I just showed you in South America. You also see blue, which is actually forest gain. And for a number of people, they've looked at these matched pinks and blues and said, well, that's great. We're gaining forest at the same rate we're losing it. But often this is a signal of more intensive management of landscapes. And so clear cutting and then rapid regeneration with planted trees. And often those trees are, in Oregon, actually, they are native species. In many parts of the world, they're not. But they're grown in more monocultural stands. And then the length of time they're allowed to grow before they're cut is typically quite a lot shorter than you'd expect under a natural disturbance regime. So, in East Western Oregon, you're looking at about a 40, 45 year rotation age. And this potentially could cause problems for bird species. So that you're the first one to see some of these data, but this is what I've been working on with a group at OSU and also in New Brunswick. This is 3 provinces in Eastern Canada. You're looking at a species distribution map for black burning warbler in 1985. And the yellow areas are areas of high habitat quality, high probability of occurrence for the species. And the blue are places of low probability of occurrence. So what I'm going to do is play this video forward. Just going to tell me if it's not working, right, Jeff? And you can see a rapid decline in habitat over this period of time. So what's going on? If I just toggle back and forth here, you can see quite a bit of change. Let's see if I can actually move past that. What's not happening is forest is not being lost in New Brunswick. This figure shows over time from 1985 to 2020 how forest has changed. And you can see it's pretty flat and black. On the other hand, these top 7 habitat declining species that we've quantified have been losing a lot of habitat over time. And this is primarily due to changes in age class structure and a tendency toward planting softwood trees in places that would be mixed forest, and in some cases hardwood forest. So degradation is an important driver of declines. So Jeff tells me now that I'm allowed to take 1 question, and we can leave this and I can spend the time on the presentation, or we can listen for 1. Jeff, it's up to you.
Well, so let's give folks just a second to take a rest and you can enter your questions into the chat. And again, if there aren't quick questions, and there is a question in there on grasslands right now, I'm going to wait and see if there's others, since we are mostly forest focused here.
And
so
Jeff, if you can read it, that would be great, because I've got my presentation in full screen mode here.
Right, I will certainly read it. So I'm just waiting a second here to see what comes in that. So just take a break for a second. So here we go. So let's go ahead and read this one. Here you go, Matt. What is the relative contribution to decline of habitat on the wintering grounds relative to the breeding grounds?
That's an excellent question, and actually one that hasn't, to my knowledge, has not been examined particularly well. And the reason for that is that, first of all, we don't know a lot about migratory connectivity in migrant birds, forest birds. And by that I mean places on their breeding grounds where they connected on the wintering grounds. Where exactly do we find, where would you expect habitat loss to have population level consequences for birds we count in the breeding grounds? And then secondly, we're only just really developing good tools to map distributions on both wintering grounds and breeding grounds. So stay tuned. I think a number of groups are focusing on this question. And then of course there's the question of carryover effects and how changes in wintering ground and breeding ground habitat quality can affect mortality on migration. And we know that migration is actually one of the riskiest times of the year for birds. So that adds an additional degree of difficulty.
That's great, Matt. And so I would ask folks, you can keep adding your questions in the chat box, and we will be able to take a couple of them. And again, I'll remind folks, we'll try to answer them later and send them back via email in a week or so. All right, keep on going, Matt.
Right. I just want everyone to know that I worked a really long time on this slide, so please, this is your time to be listing. Probably some of you are too young to remember this movie featuring Kevin Costner. Highly recommend it. So if you build it, will they come? And for forest managers and wildlife biologists that do research in forests, this is a really important question. And so one of the attributes of wildlife biology that I try to outline to my undergrads as soon as they come into my classes, and None of this will be surprising to you, but often I get the question, is it good habitat or bad habitat? And of course, the answer comes back, it depends entirely on the species. And so in order to think about bird conservation in forests, you need to be thinking about which species are associated with which forest types. And anyone who's into birding in the group will know that if you want to get a big species list, you want to go to a lot of different sorts of forest. So the types of species that occur in this Oregon old growth forest, quite different to what happens in this mid-aged forest, plantation forest here. And of course, almost complete turnover into oak woodland and oak prairie, and then again into early successional post-fire forest. And this is all just in Oregon. So if you want to maintain bird diversity, you really need to think landscape scale. And also you need to learn which species are associated with which forest types, which takes quite a bit of effort, but we're certainly amassing lots of data in that area. But the good news is about bird species being so tightly tied to forest structure and composition is it does open up the opportunity to manage forests in a way that can increase habitat amounts and then presumably have positive impacts on populations. And so I just want to give two examples of how management can alter bird abundance. One is from a study that I've been involved with a number of others, Jake Verschile and AJ Kroll in Oregon, where we encouraged or convinced forest companies to do different degrees of intensive forest management. And what do I mean by that? Well, clear cutting is the primary management regime on industrial lands in Oregon. And then it's usually followed by herbicide spray to control competing vegetation so Douglas fir can grow more quickly. So we had 4 treatment types, and we actually had 8 blocks with each of these 4 in them. And they range from a control where there's no spray at all. You can see it's nice and bushy and woolly with high plant diversity. A light, which is similar to what's done on state lands in Oregon, and moderate, which is more industrial, and intensive, which is a lot of herbicide and really beyond what most people typically do. And so just very briefly, don't get too lost in the weeds here, but here we've got one species, common yellowthroat. We collected data from 2011 up to the current time, actually. And the black dotted line here is the control, that bushy photo that I showed. And the blue, orange, and red dots are light, moderate, and intensive management. So you can see that in the first year following spray, common yellowthroat was quite well below, about half the abundance in those places that were sprayed. And this pattern continued on all the way through till about 2016, where we start seeing some return or equalization of abundance across those treatments. So you can see that for this species, forest management has a really strong influence on its abundance. And this was the case for a number of foliage gleaning species, migrants in particular. McGilvery's warbler, orange-crowned song sparrow, Swainson's thrush, Wilson's warbler. There are also other species that actually didn't seem to respond negatively at all to these treatments. White-crowned sparrow showed a negative effect in the first couple of years and then rebounded. Amazingly, violet-green swallow actually showed a slight positive effect. But the take-home message here is that forest management has a strong influence on bird abundance and actually breeding success as well. So this plot shows you the effect of herbicide on the x-axis, and then on the y is breeding bird survey trend estimate. So these are the data going into Ken and others' paper from Science last fall, these long-term trend estimates. And you can see the more negatively affected species were by intensive management, the more likely it is that their population trends are being reduced. And this is totally correlative, but it does raise the point that potentially reducing herbicide management intensity could have positive effects on bird populations. Some of the subtext there is that actually these early seral species were being squeezed on federal lands too, because there just wasn't that much early seral broadleaf forest on federal lands. And that's changed a bit with the recent fires, but we'll see what happens. So the second case study I wanted to show you was another study of ours from Western Oregon, this time in mid-age forest. And during the period of the spotted owl controversies especially, the question was leveled at biologists, is there a way of speeding up the onset of old growth? By doing thinning, can we make trees grow faster? And then these forests will take on some of these attributes that old growth has. And so I was lucky enough to inherit a study from John Hayes where they'd done some initial sampling 15 years ago. And we could look at long-term effects of this thinning on bird abundance, an experimental study on bird abundance. And so what we saw, and again, you don't need to pay too much attention to the details of the graph, but initially, some species showed quite negative effects of thinning. This hermit warbler, for example, was depressed in relation to the controls. This is the heavy thinning. This is the control. And so, when you open up the canopy and reduce the total leaf area, the species did worse. Watch what happens 15 years after the fact. We actually see a slight positive effect of heavy thinning on hermit warblers. And that's because the trees got bigger faster, the crowns got deeper, and this likely increased the food supply for the species. And so same for the Wilson's warbler. I'll move through this a bit quickly. But then a third species, we examined, I think, about 30 in total, winter wren, or Pacific wren now, showed a slight positive effect initially following the thin, but 15 years later, it's actually doing even worse in the heavy thin than it was to begin with. So another important take-home message then is that species are not responding similarly to forest management treatments, and there's never going to be one forest management treatment to rule them all when it comes to bird conservation. If you're interested in the mechanism here, Pacific wren likes dead wood, and by going in and salvaging mortality on trees by thinning, likely there's a lot less dead wood on the ground, less dead standing wood, and the species probably decline in abundance as a result of that. So just finally to hammer home this point, bird species associated with very different habitats. And really, if you're going to manage for them, you need to think about landscape scale planning. And this is an image I use for my undergrads quite often. On the left, we've got black-burning warbler species distribution model around Fundy National Park, which is that black boundary you can see in the middle. And darker colors mean higher probability of occurrence. And then look at common yellowthroat, an early successional species that really is very rare inside the park and predominantly lives in clear cuts or other disturbances outside the park. So really there's no one management type at the stand level that could maintain both of these species. Okay, at that point, I think I can take another question. Jeff?
Yeah, Matt, thanks a lot. And thanks for there were some really nice graphics and graphs in there as well. So there's some great questions coming in. So thanks and keep them coming, folks. But the one that I think is pretty relevant to some of the things you were hitting on, Matt, is from Daniel. And it's really about the really intense fires that they've had in Northern California. And do you think that that this kind of eruption of pine siskin may be related to those really highly intense fires in Northern California?
Oh boy, that's a really tricky question. And I might pass on it and deflect a little bit to say that, one fairly well-known impact of broad-scale disturbance is our displacement effects. John Hagan in Maine calls them concussion effects. And this is when you end up with big areas of the landscape that have been disturbed, and this results in species settling in the next nearest appropriate habitat. So that's definitely what we're expecting to see at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in the Cascades of Oregon, where we had a fire burn right up to the edge of the boundary. It could well be that this year bird abundance in the residual old forest goes through the roof because we see breeding dispersal by those birds that have come from the disturbance next door.
No, thanks, Matt. That's helpful. So, and you still got plenty of time left. It's only 1:32, so take it away.
I see somebody else might have answered that in the chat, which might be helpful. It was a big eruption year, so that's certainly quite likely to be a cause. We're getting pine grosbeaks all over the place in eastern Canada here. So the final part of my talk, part 3 here, I'm going to talk about this really difficult question, and that is how do you determine how much habitat to maintain on a landscape, and then what pattern should that habitat be in? And I'll talk less about patterns today just because there's not much time, but how do you establish how much habitat? Should we be maintaining big swaths like this hardwood forest on the left, or are little amounts like this, the hardwood forest surrounded by plantation on the right, okay. And this, if I get, in terms of phone calls from my students who have gone off to become managers, this is one of the main questions that I still get by phone over the years. And I wish I could say that it's resolved, but it's a very difficult question to get at. So what I'm going to do is talk about three major ways to try and address it. One, researchers have proposed that you can use threshold relationships to try and get at how much habitat is necessary. So in this cartoon I've drawn, we've got habitat amount on the x-axis, species response on the right, and you'd be a bit of a silly person to manage anywhere to the left of this threshold, because it would result in a precipitous drop in either the occurrence or the reproduction or maybe even population trends of this artificial species. So really, if you can establish and quantify these thresholds, it gives you a target that you can try and manage for. And so a number of researchers, this is a very recent paper that argues for a 40% forest amount threshold to maintain biodiversity. It's a little bit tricky having a single target for lots and lots of species. And as I've said, habitat is a very species-specific concept. So much more usefully, it'd be good to know how much species-specific habitat you want to maintain in a landscape. And so we have tried to do some work on this. These two of these maps will look familiar already, black burning and common yellowthroat, habitat amount across this area of eastern Canada. I've added two more. One is ovenbird, and the other is black-throated green warbler, which, as you can see, is quite generalized in this part of the world. And using maps like this, we estimated whether there were thresholds and the probability of a patch being occupied as a function of how much habitat there was in the landscape surrounding those patches. And so you can see the spatial scale differs a bit across species. That's not that important. But what's important about this figure is that these gray bars with confidence intervals around an estimated threshold give you some idea that there's this nonlinear threshold relationship between habitat amount at the landscape scale and the probability of occurrence for some of these species. It's not universal, but you can see this threshold can range from around 10% habitat up to around 30% habitat for a number of species. So this isn't, and it's not a bad place to start when it comes to thinking about management targets for how much habitat for each species to maintain in the landscape. Now, the problem with this sort of thing is that these are correlative models and there's nothing about demography in here. We don't know how well birds are surviving or reproducing. We don't have any information about dispersal. So a number of brave souls have gone on to try and develop population viability models for bird species. And these involve two major steps. One is having a good model of how the landscape is going to change in the future based on forest management activities, and then coupling those with population viability models. And I just want to describe these really briefly as being brutal. It's really difficult. We're spending millions of dollars just to get the right population parameters for marbled murrelet in Oregon. And I don't know what the estimate is now for spotted owl here, but I'm expecting in the tens of millions of dollars have been spent on the species. And arguably, we still don't have enough data to really parameterize good population viability models. The key parameters being survival, reproduction, dispersal, but then also interannual variation in those parameters. It's just really tough. I don't want to dissuade you from it, but this is a challenging way to go, but much better in a way because you have this important demographic component. And so there have been a number of important studies using PVAs. One was Russ Landy. This was one of the papers that kind of led into the Northwest Forest Plan and determining how much habitat was enough across Oregon, Washington, California. And then a few other studies since then have also used PVAs for a variety of species. So the problem is we just don't have data. Number one, we don't even have good habitat assessments for most species. By the way, those of you, I'm really enjoying the thought of those of you who are listing birds right now, trying to copy down all these species, but I'll just leave you with that. So we don't have habitat assessments for very many species, and certainly we don't have demographic data. And then somebody raised the question of wintering grounds and migratory connectivity. Imagine how troubling the model would get if we had to include information about changes on the wintering grounds as well. So tricky. It's been done, but it's a really difficult thing to do. So what do people do in the face of some of this uncertainty? First, they tend to adopt umbrella or indicator species. And some of these species probably aren't strange to any of you. Regurgitated woodpecker, sage grouse, and spotted owl being the most well-known. And these are iconic species. And the basic assumption here is that because they're more sensitive than the rest, maybe larger home ranges, maybe more specialized, if you can look after these species and manage enough habitat at the landscape scale, you're going to look after all the species that are less sensitive than them. So the problem here is probably evident to those of you that know spotted owl well. It could well be that some extrinsic factor causes decline in these species that has nothing to do with how much habitat you're maintaining. And so in Oregon, for example, we have this nasty Canadian barred owl that's coming, and I'm being facetious because I'm Canadian, and really causing demographic issues for a spotted owl that has little to do, or likely little to do, with the total amount of habitat in the landscape. So that leads to solution 2, which is the disturbance emulation approach. It comes by a number of other names. But the idea here is that if we can manage landscapes in a way that approximates natural disturbance, these are the landscapes that the species we know have evolved under, and therefore our management should provide enough habitat for the species in those landscapes. So this is an idea that was first put forward by Bob Seymour and Mac Hunter back in 1992. And I'll just walk you through some basic examples. So in eastern hardwood forests of New Hampshire, Vermont, where I did my postdoc, gap replacing or just individual tree falls is a predominant driver of disturbance. So maybe selection cutting at stand and landscape levels approximates that. On the other hand, in places maybe sort of boreal fringe in Canada where budworm disturbance is more common, opening up small patches to reflect those budworm disturbances is a more effective way to go. And then finally, in landscapes that are predominantly stand replacing, like fire or broad scale windstorms, variable retention harvests or bigger cuts could reflect those disturbances and therefore maintain the species that are used to those disturbances. So the tricky bit here is that it's not just stand level treatments we're talking about, but also the broader landscape scale age class distributions, and approximating the age class distribution of a fire regime, even a very short fire regime rotation like this one, 57 years, can be difficult. And this involves leaving a lot of old forest out there on the landscape. And so if you have a disturbance regime like we do in Western Oregon, which could be an average return interval of 200, 250 years, it means maintaining a lot of old forest on the landscape. So just a little bit of further reading. This is the paper I just mentioned is in this book edited by Mac Hunter. The book on the left is one that we produced a number of years ago for Eastern Canada that outlines this natural disturbance emulation approach and the indicator species approach. So there is some empirical evidence to support the idea that the ecological context in which species evolved influences their sensitivity to disturbance. So this is a paper we had out a couple of years ago, and in it we used data sets from around the world, a bunch of landscape ecologists. You can see the red dots and the blue dots. And we categorized those locations according to whether they had typically, over historical time, had very little canopy disturbance, stand replacing disturbance, or whether they had high disturbance. And I realize these are very coarse categories, but we used historical data to try and do that with all these data sets. And then sure enough, we found that for a number of families, but birds in particular, we found that fragmentation sensitivity was far higher. So if forest is lost and fragmented in the tropics and these red dots, species are far more likely to have difficulty than in places where historical disturbance is more common, fires and glaciations and windstorms, for example. Okay, so it's all well and good to talk about some of these ecological forestry approaches that I'm mentioning, trying to emulate natural disturbance, trying to maintain enough habitat across the landscape in order to maintain umbrella species. But this is a fundamental issue that keeps me awake way too often. And that is that as much as we would like to think that we can reduce our pressure on our global system, there's very little evidence that we're capable of doing so. And so this graph just shows for wood alone how much demand has increased over time since the 1960s. And this is basically in lockstep with human population growth. And as you know, we're expecting our population to cap out at around 10 billion or 11 billion people. And so how do we try and balance conservation of birds with what seems to be an increasing demand? And so lately we've been thinking about something that has been talked about in agricultural landscapes for a number of years now. A group out of Cambridge has been focusing on it. And this has really become quite a debate in conservation biology between people who argue for land sharing versus land sparing. And land sharing means that you're doing ecological approaches in the case of agriculture, soft, organic agriculture. Land sparing is more the idea that you do intensive agriculture or intensive forestry, and then reserve. That allows you to reserve a lot of forest because you're growing everything you need on a smaller area. Ecological is fine, but the problem is yields tend to be a lot lower in ecological forestry. And as a result, it needs to cover a larger area. So this cartoon I have on the left here outlines that general idea. Say, well, this arbitrary 20% or 20 production target. Under land sharing, you could have quite a lot of reserve. The rest is an ecological forestry. Everyone's quite happy. But with the same wood production target, if you do intensive management, you can actually almost double the reserve area, given the differences in yields. But the result gets a lot more stark if you talk about increasing production. So under a land sharing regime, most of the landscape is now attributed to some kind of disturbance emulation or selection cutting type regime, very little reserve. Whereas over here, if you do high yield forestry, you can afford to have more reserve. And the unfortunate thing to date is that there's just very little information out there on what is a better approach to managing whole landscapes. And I think all of you could come up with your own hypotheses about whether it would be better in your region. And I think it will vary regionally to do intensive management on a small portion of the land base and reserve the rest, or whether it's better to do more of an ecological approach, but have a larger footprint. So with that, I'll stop. I do have an epilogue that I can talk about if Jeff lets me and there's time, but we'll just go over these general conclusions. First, 3 major causes of doom and gloom, in my opinion. 1, climate. This is more a future projected effect. 2, habitat loss. This is well known, by far the most powerful negative effect on bird populations. And then 3, forest degradation, I would say, which is habitat loss without actually losing forest. The nice thing about birds is they respond to changes in forest structure, and we can manage those using various techniques. And I can talk about the details about it if there are questions. And then finally, managing landscapes for all bird species populations is very tricky because of all these different habitat associations. But here I've introduced a number of tools that can be used to try and establish how much habitat is enough across species. These include thresholds, population viability analyses, use of indicator or umbrella species, natural disturbance emulation, and finally this idea of a triad or land sharing, land sparing approach. How are we doing for time, Jeff? Should I take a question or should I talk a little bit about silviculture for climate change?
Well, Matt, so I think, so we do have a little time. I'd like to leave about 10 minutes for the questions because there are some really good questions in here. And people did get a little distracted. They saw an imposter in there. They saw a red-bellied woodpecker posing as a red-cockaded. So that distracted
oh my goodness,
some folks. But at any rate, so the imposter was found. So nice job there, folks.
It was to make sure everyone was paying attention. I'm glad that is.
So there's some great questions in here, but I would hit your blog there real quickly, and then we'll take a couple of these questions that seem to really weave a thread throughout. Go ahead.
Sure. So, I find in dealing with thinking about birds and climate change, often it leaves you with a little bit of a doom and gloom attitude, because you have the realization that there's not that much an individual can do to affect this global phenomenon that's happening. And I just wanted to highlight some potential ways that we could think about conserving forests to adapt to climate change. And so we've been doing some work in Western Oregon on under canopy temperatures across a gradient in forest structure. On the left, we've got old growth stands at the H.J. Andrews experimental forest. On the right, a plantation. And across 183 sites, we had these hobo data loggers distributed. And I won't show you any graphs, but the take-home message was that during peak breeding season, old growth forests were up to 2.5 degrees cooler than plantation forests, even though canopy cover was actually a little bit higher in plantation forests. And so this led us to the question of, could you actually try to maintain old growth forest on a landscape, thereby providing some climate buffer for species as the climate warms, or do silviculture in order to, as I said, bring on old growth characteristics. And so to test this idea, we looked at breeding bird survey data. Again, those are the squiggles on the left in relation to climate change over 30 years. That's the heat ramp on the left. And then also the amount of old growth along breeding bird survey routes. And I'll walk you through this slowly because it's a bit tricky, but on this axis we have change in June temperature. So these are landscapes that have had warming of 2 degrees or more over the last 30 years. These are landscapes that have had actually cooling. And interestingly, across the Northwest, there's quite a bit of patchiness in climate change effects. And this axis is old growth proportion, so how much old growth there is along a route. And you can see that population trends of this Wilson's warbler vary quite dramatically. If there's no old growth on a route and it's warmed a lot, we see quite negative population trends in percent per year. If there's a lot of old growth in the landscape, even if warming has happened, we actually see net neutral or even positive population trends for the species. So there are things that can be thought about in terms of the way we plan for and manage the land. We had a similar effect for hermit warbler. So maintaining old growth, bringing on old growth characteristics sooner. And then also there's a general idea called the insurance effect. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned Chris Both's work on pied flycatcher and how pied flycatcher can be missing the peak timing of food availability. Well, in those oak woodlands, it tends to be quite this simplified, 1 or 2 species. But we have many forests in the world that are highly diverse, and they're leafing out at different times, and herbivorous arthropods are coming out at different times. And so one hypothesis is that if you can maintain that diversity, you're providing effect kind of a food buffer for migrant species when they arrive on the breeding grounds. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'm happy to answer a couple of questions.
Thanks, Matt. That was a great presentation, and we are getting some great questions. I'm going to toss you one that's a pretty broad question, and I think it gets to a number of points you were trying to make. So the question is from Caesar, and it's, what does it mean to manage forests for bird biodiversity? And he goes on to say, is the goal to restore pre-industrial levels of biodiversity? And then he makes a comment, it seems to be an overwhelming goal given current conditions. And I think, you kind of set that up with your target thresholds. And there's some other questions in there that seem to contrast that nicely, talking about things like species-specific forest management versus this biodiversity. So can you hit on that a little bit, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's you hit on the heart of the problem with that question. The two major examples I gave or methods to try and maintain diversity, bird diversity, one you can see almost as an upper end, and that's mimicking a historical disturbance regime. Gives you the top end of how much habitat you would have in a landscape for these various species. But many would argue that returning to historical habitat amounts is really an impossibility given human use of the land. And some would argue also that it's a bit of it's a shifting target, isn't it? The climate that we have now is nothing like what it was in pre-settlement North America. So it has challenges in that respect. But still, I think that, again, given that species evolved to cope with that sort of landscape pattern and amount, it's not a bad target as a upper end, an upper goal. And then at the minimum, you really have this population viability modeling approach, or the threshold approach, where you're looking at it on a species by species level and determining what the lowest amounts you could have before you see extirpations from landscapes. And so quite likely what'll happen, ideally what happens is something in between those two. I wouldn't want to be trying to manage for minimums all the time, because if an external stressor does come in, climate change or even natural disturbance, that could push species over the brink. But somewhere in the middle there is probably a sweet spot between, returning entirely to the historical range of variation and age class structure of forests versus the bare minimum with individual species management and having just enough on the landscape to maintain populations.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I'm going to turn to one that's a little more specific, and I think it allows you to make some points as well. So this one's from Michael, and he's talking about the lake states, and he mentions what seems to be one of the bigger issues is a lack of young and brushy habitat, both on a large scale, like aspen coppice, and on a small scale, like patches within mature forests. How important is that, are those issues in, and he says, in your region? So contrasting what it might be like in the Pacific Northwest versus the lake states versus maritime Canada.
Right. No, it's an important question, and it's one that's incredibly region specific and even time specific. So as I said, when I first arrived in Oregon 15 years ago, I started looking at population trends for these shrub associates, early cereal species like orange crown warbler, Wilson's warbler, and others. And the surprise was they're declining at rates around the same as the spotted owl. So orange crown warbler at the time was declining at rates of about 4% per year. The spotted owl was about 3.2. So in Oregon, a bit of an alarm bell rose, and we spent quite a bit of time trying to get to the bottom of what might be causing those declines. One of the elements that's important is thinking about, when did the breeding bird surveys start? And then it started in the 1960s, and at that time in the Northwest, a huge amount of timber was being cut. And so probably we started that survey at a time that had unprecedented disturbance. So I expect some of those declines in some ways are more a return to a historical baseline than something to be of massive concern. But at some point, I expect we could be declining below what historical habitat amounts could have been. And again, the recent fires, I think we're at 750,000 acres, might reverse some of that. On the plus side, that paper I mentioned toward the end of my talk on how adaptable species are to disturbance, I expect some of these early cereal species often have, quite rapid life history strategies, so they can respond quickly, breed quickly. Whereas some of the ones associated with later cereal forest, especially something like a marble murrelet, they don't do too well with disturbance. They have a very small number of young, long-lived, so might be much more prone to habitat loss effects. In Eastern Canada, it's really the least of my worries are species associated with early cereal forest, but interestingly, we do see declines in some of those species as well, but it's not because we're not making habitat for them. It's more likely, I expect, climate effects.
All right. Well, that's kind of maybe that's a nice segue to this question. And so this question is from Luke, and it's, is there a flaw in generally managing for historical natural vegetation and managing vegetation to mimic disturbances based on fire return intervals while promoting old growth where possible? And then he goes on to say, some species such as T&E need more focused vegetation management. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Matt, do you want to reread that, or do you?
No, it's okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I'll get the general gist. I'll give it a stab, but no, I think that's using, the take-home message here is to use our brains, isn't it? And I think if we have species that are declining rapidly, doing a wholesale shift toward a disturbance emulation approach that would remove those species habitat would be a silly thing to do. So I think in terms of hoping to keep common species common, a disturbance emulation approach might be appropriate, but then nested within that, if you've got species that are continuing to decline, absolutely. Targeted habitat management, population management are really important elements of any portfolio, really, of conservation approaches in forests. So now it's a good question because you really don't want to go down a single road that I've mentioned wholesale. And some species are declining at rates that really all the focus should be on determining what those mechanisms are and if we can reverse those trends. Hopefully that helps a bit.
Yeah, I thought that was, I thought you hit that just right. So Matt, here's a question that I'm not really going to expect you to answer, but I'm going to read it because I think because it sets up a future webinar of ours. And so this is from Julia, and she says, can you speak on what you're doing to decolonize science and amplify the voices of indigenous scientists, naturalists, elders, and communities since they have been managing their land successfully since the start of humans? And what I'll say is we do have an upcoming, one of the webinars in this series is going to be on November 16th, and it's integrating indigenous and traditional practices in the bird-friendly forest management, and it's going to be presented by Frank Lake with the U.S. Forest Service, and Frank has done a lot of work in this area, and he is native, and so at any rate, that'll be a good discussion. And I will say that Frank also has a presentation coming up. I think it's next week, and it sounds really interesting. Jim, if you can put that in the chat somewhere, I know you had that. So at any rate, but if you want to take a shot at that, Matt, you're welcome to. But I think that's, I'm not sure that's where your work lies. But I can either move on.
No, actually, that's a really timely question. Actually, a paper came out just, I think, yesterday in PNAS on exactly that, the role of indigenous societies in doing conservation of forest biodiversity. So I encourage people to look that up, and I can send it out with the answers to some of the questions.
That would be great. I think that would be a really good thing to share with folks. And again, we will share. We're going to go through and look at all these questions and try to provide our best answers, and then we'll send that out to everyone via email. I'm going to read one more, and then we'll go from there. And this one's from Sharon Matt. Where can we find regional information about frequency and severity of forest disturbances? And here's the kicker. Prior to European settlement, to help determine how much of each forest age class structure should be in the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, the scientific literature is obviously the place to start. It's harder, the further east you go in North America, the harder it gets, but there are still data to inform those sorts of things. For example, in eastern US and Canada, witness trees were used by early explorers, and those give you some idea about, they actually listed the tree species and sometimes even the size, and it gives you some idea about the historical species composition of our forests. And from that, you can sort of infer something about the disturbance regime. If it's all shade tolerant species, it's unlikely disturbance was very common historically. Also, there's some interesting work on using ecological land classification to reconstruct what sort of forests would have been in a location historically. And some people use forest modeling, a combination of potential forest work and also information about the climate, to try and estimate what the historical range of variation would have been in frequency of burns and size of burns. So Craig Lorimer, if you're in the east of the US, has done quite a bit of work on that in New England and the Maritimes of Canada. In the West, we have a much more recent history, and we really can turn to indigenous accounts of what our forests were like, information on the historical frequency of burning, often by humans, and get some idea from there. So, and also fire scars and trees are an obvious place to go if you're in the West or somewhere that has trees that live long enough to have fire scars. So there's a wealth of information. You really have to spend time looking, which is tricky. But But I think we're in a lot better place here than in Europe. And questions on a talk like this would be a lot more critical. I mean, this is just something for all of you to think about, but what does it mean to manage for historical range variation in a landscape that's been settled by industrialized type Europeans for many centuries? And in many cases, and this is one of the interesting things about that PNAS paper that came out, species have evolved in the context of humans for tens of thousands of years. So there's some really interesting, that's a whole separate conversation to have, probably over beers if we're all in the same place, but certainly an interesting direction to go.
So Matt, that's excellent. So we're coming to the end of our hour. I will say that there's some excellent, that last question. I mean, we're all, scientists are all trying to figure out what things did previously look at. I know earlier in my career, I worked with Grace Brush at Johns Hopkins, and she looked at soil cores and the pollen that were in these very deep sediment cores. And if you looked at the forest inventory and analysis reports from the U.S. Forest Service for the last 50 years, which is the time frame we're looking at here, you'll see that red maple is one of those species that is really increasing across everything east of the Mississippi. And yet, if you look back into those sediment cores, although red maple is certainly there, it's in very small amounts. And so it's just interesting to think about those changes, and we're just still figuring it out. So Matt, you helped us a great deal figure that out, and I hope folks can join us when we come back together on May 18th to talk about climate change, adaptation impacts, and forest bird recovery. So thanks so much, Matt, and thanks to everyone for joining us. You guys are making this series great, so thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks everybody.